This is Twisted Passages with award-winning author Marie Sutro. Now, let's take a deep dive into the dark world of psychological thrillers and meet the authors who created them.
Hello, and welcome to Twisted Passages. I'm your host, Marie Sutro, and today we have the dynamic duo of #1 New York Times bestselling author of over 40 books, Sara Shepard, and award-winning writer, director, and composer, Miles Joris-Peyrafitte, to talk about their amazing new project, GASLIGHT. And let me promise you, it is every bit as good as the iconic movie that it shares the name of. Welcome, Miles and Sara.
Thank you for having us. This is so exciting.
Thanks. It is so exciting for me. Now, the two of you came together. You wrote this amazing book that had me on the edge of my seat the entire time, emotionally conflicted the entire time, turning pages eagerly. Can you give us an overview for the readers who don't know what GASLIGHT is about?
Sure. Yeah. Briefly, it's about a woman named Rebecca Reyes who, when we meet her, she's sort of stuck in between this kind of idyllic life with her husband and kids, and she's stuck between that and this sort of continual haunting from her past and these sort of like unresolved traumas and questions. We meet her at a time when she's really trying to keep the two things separate and trying to live this life that she's worked really hard to have, but is finding it quite difficult. And sort of the inciting incident, if you will, for the story is really her best friend from high school showing up at her door many years later and beginning to challenge the separation of those two worlds. And so the book and the story really spins out what that trauma and what that other life was, and its kind of implications to each other and also to the family. Kind of puts her in the position of trying to understand what her responsibility towards other people is, and that's kind of like a theme throughout the story. Whether that's to community or family or to yourself or past life or things like that. You find out pretty quickly that all of that involves the cult. Goes into that world and builds a lot of the kind of a lot of her past and present, and then how she sort of has to, or how all of them kind of have to come to terms with it and deal with it throughout the course of the story. Is that good? Does that make sense?
It totally does. Sara, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. No. I think another thing that's fun about the story is that you don't know, and I think that will keep readers on edge, is you don't really know everybody's intentions. You don't know if they're good or if they're bad or why they're there, or and it's sort of, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting is that people can be and feel many things at once. They're a good friend, but they also might be trying to manipulate you. And, they're sort of torn between, kind of being controlled by someone and wanting to kind of take their life into their own hands and all of that. So, it definitely keeps you on the edge of your seat that way, of kind of like, what, who can we trust? In this story, like, because not, kind of nobody is trustworthy. Everybody's kind of hiding something.
And one of the best parts is that the characters and the dialogue is so well crafted, and the way that you slow feed us all the information. You've got multiple time frames. You're going back in time in Rebecca's history. You are jumping geographies, both in time frame and, just even in real time, you're jumping to different places. What inspired this story? Because it is just amazing.
Well, thank you. What inspired it is sort of manyfolds. One, to me, I've always been incredibly drawn to this sort of like to this age range in terms of characters of what's going on in people's lives as they're coming into adulthood, and this obviously takes place in adulthood and then sort of in that transitional period. Partially because I think that it's one of the first times where we're kind of dealing and seeing these questions, and we're coming from a time in our lives where, whether it's through parents or authority figures, things have very clear answers, or are supposed to have very clear answers, and for the first time you're sort of like diving into the ambiguity of the world, and that can be really frustrating and really scary. It's also very revealing, of who we sort of are as we're making mistakes and figuring that kind of stuff out. um, so for me, that's always been like a really, really fertile ground for storytelling. Then, I grew up in downtown Albany, New York, and I grew up in a slightly like cult-like light environment. It wasn't a cult, there was no leader or anything like that, but it was definitely a very like intentional living community based around this really alternative great school, and it was an unbelievable place to grow up. Um, but so like community dynamics I was very aware of, and sort of, and then not far from us, like 15 miles away, was an actual cult called Nexium. And so for a long time, it was something that was sort of on my mind, knowing people who sort of like went into that world or whatever. And so I think for me, that's really the idea, first of all, of this like inciting incident of your past walking back into your life, and these things that you feel guilty about, these things that you haven't sort of sorted out. And this idea of playing with time, because I think that so much of it has to do with memory and has to do with the way that we sort of construct our own narratives. So that sort of collision of things, and really wanting to like deal with this big sort of question of cults and belief and truth and fiction, but doing it in a really intimate, interpersonal way between people, and the effects that it has in that level, as opposed to just kind of the broader strokes. So that for me is where the initial sort of like impetus for the story came from, and in its first form, it was a podcast. And so a very sort of different kind of podcast. It was, a narrative podcast where there was no voiceover or anything like that. It was really everything that was taking place in the space on this day where this person shows up. And so the story, I wanted something that could be articulated through sounds and things in different rooms, and people having these sort of side conversations and building a mystery. And then when it came to doing a novel, I think that whatever your medium is, you need to sort of have the understanding of the tools of that medium that best tell your story. And so Sara was and is such a like an obvious, we couldn't believe it when we first had a meeting with Sara about it, because like for me, filmmaking or making the podcast, it's always about like what can you show or hear through exposition or things like that. And I had really no experience in sort of how do you articulate these things through internal monologue and through the sort of like diving into that. And Sara's such a master at that, that it felt like you always want to partner with somebody who has all of their strengths where your weaknesses are. And so in that way, it was such a dream, because all of a sudden, she really gave voice to the inside of these characters' heads in a fashion that was like pretty like breathtaking to like experience happening, but yeah, Sara, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, the thing that I was so interesting is that on my own, I love sort of fiction podcasts. They're hard to find, and I wish there were more of them. but I listened to. I'm trying to think. There was a really famous one that got turned into a TV show, and I can't think of the name of it right now.
Homecoming.
Homecoming, yes.
Yeah.
So this was I was listening to Homecoming and a few others sort of like it. Also Q Code. I mean, Q Code definitely had a lot of interesting podcasts. And then Gaslight was suggested to me, and I sort of tore through Gaslight. So I knew about this podcast long before I was ever approached like, hey, this might be a novel. Would you be interested? So I already knew the story. I was already really interested in the story. And I think I think that's why the dialogue is so strong, because there's all this like material to use. And as a writer of novels, it was sort of like cheating because I already had characters that were so fleshed out. And also, Miles, you wrote scripts, sort of an adaptation for TV as well. And I used a lot of those. So it was like, oh my gosh, there are these really interesting characters already here. There's already this backstory. There's already this like fully, and I knew what NXIVM was. NXIVM has become more popular, I guess, in the last couple of years because of The Vow and because of a couple of other like podcasts and things like that. So all of and I love cults. So it was like, this is.
Wait a minute. Should we worry, Sarah?
Yeah, right. I might join one. So for me, it was a dream too, because it was like, oh my gosh, I already listened to this podcast. I already thought these characters were so interesting, but the episodes were very short. So it was kind of like, oh, what else is happening? Like, what else could happen? So there was a lot there, but there was also a lot of space to kind of get into their heads and kind of get deeper into how they felt about things and get deeper into their pasts and all of that, which is all stuff I love doing. But it, for me, was a really great project because as a writer, it's so lonely sometimes when you have to come up with all of it by yourself. It was very, very fun to take the podcast and all the scripts and sort of adapt them to make them make sense for a novel.
So that kind of begs the question to me, again, coming from a writer's perspective, was it faster, in the technical writing of it, because you had these characters that were so well developed, because you had their voices?
Yes.
Was it a fast write for you?
Yeah. Yes. It was easy to outline. And once we had an outline, which was not even that hard to do because like there was all this material. Yes, I remember it was, I just sort of had a roadmap, and I kind of felt like the characters just sort of took over because I could hear them because of the podcast, and I just sort of had a sense of who they were already, and that's like one of the hardest things to do when writing a book is figuring out who your characters are and making them real and making them, authentic and making people believe that they're actual people.
Well, one of the things that makes this so real and authentic is the psychological aspects of it. And not to give away any spoilers, of course, but it is a cult. So there is going to be some level of, at the high levels of the cult, wanting everybody to be thinking the same thing. And what fascinated me about the approach with the different timelines and everything, looking at how people get into these situations. So many times I was reminded, and the first time I was reminded of it, it kind of set my brain back a little bit because, as I said, I was a huge fan of Gaslight and I love psychological thrillers. All of a sudden I started thinking about Taming of the Shrew. And when I first read that, I was in high school, I think, like most of us are. And I was like, oh, this guy, he just wants to, get her under his boot, and it's the era and it's the time. But that whole thing, is it the sun or the moon in the sky? That fundamental way of breaking someone and getting them to say that what is true is not true, and getting them to question their own reality, and breaking that down to the very question of who am I? What am I? how did you guys dig into that? Obviously, Miles, you took a first pass with the podcast. Sara, you delved a lot deeper with this immensely awesome book. How did you both come about that and those psychological elements? Because it was just so well done.
That's something that was really, really the kind of the scariest part. And when I started writing the series, that was something that was became really important in researching more and reading reading a lot of books from people who have come out of cults and people who have family members in cults. There is this because I mean, it's important to say most of these cults have pretty similar ideas, and they have very similar tactics of sort of manipulation and gaslighting and thought control. And but the language changes, and there's this sort of buy-in for all of them that an individual needs to make, and it feels like a small buy-in in a way. It's like people refer to it as like a rumble strip, or not a rumble strip, you know, those things that you can drive over, but if you back up it'll pop your tires. And it can be an idea that feels innocuous. It can be an idea that almost feels really uplifting in a way. This idea of abandoning your idea of victimhood, you know. And I think that was something when we were talking about really delving into it as a novel, this idea of victimhood and who can lay claim to your victimhood and who can't. In one way, there's something very empowering about the idea that your identity is not that of a victim. And if you allow your identity to be completely beholden to this idea of your victimhood, that you're obfuscating a lot of other things about yourself that can be equally as powerful or whatever. So like with a lot of these cults, there's sometimes interesting and profound and useful ideas that are manipulated and taken really out of control, right? All of a sudden, this idea of like, you are not just a victim becomes anything bad that happens to you is only bad because you make it that way, right? And so for a lot of cults, that's the first thing that they take away from followers, is that you know, this moment of trauma is actually the most beautiful moment in your life, and it's the time that you're actually feeling alive and you're actually feeling this. And if you feel like a victim, that's because you're in your own like mind trap, you know. And so that was, I think, sort of the key into how do we deal with and how do we place this cult and this sort of like the linguistics of this idea. And then the rest kind of follows it, you know what I mean? From all the initiations and things like that. But then obviously, you know, in the TV show version of it or in the podcast version of it, that's really limited to the experiences that you can be seeing and the way people are going to articulate these things. And then and in the novel, obviously, it's so much deeper than that. You get to actually be with these characters as they're doing this sort of like balancing act of, wait, but this is for me. I'm so empowered by this thing versus, am I empowered by this or am I imprisoned by this sort of thing?
And you started us off with that, and I hope it's okay to say, because it's so early. It's the epigraph. You know, that first line before you even get into page 1. And there's a quote there. I don't know if it's okay for me to read it. It is, pain is never wanted. It can be a portal to the divine. And I read that quote, and I wasn't familiar with the name at the time of the person who said it. And I thought, wow, pain can be a portal to the divine. You know, we do grow through our pain so much, and we become enlightened through it. And it already opened me up to a certain way of thinking, which, as I found out later, could be a very damaging way of thinking, as you said, Miles, where these rabbit holes go. And Sara, I have to pitch that to you. Was that your idea to put that quote there, or how did that come up?
You know, I actually don't remember. Miles, was it in any of your? Was it in the show?
The line, the end of the line, the pain is, there was a line that was something like that, but I remember after we'd done, when you sent me the first pages or whatever from it, and there was that at the beginning, I was like, we nailed it. There was the one, dude. This is awesome.
Yes, it was amazing because I started to realize as the reader, am I being gaslit? So it was really phenomenal. The two of you are such accomplished artists, each in your own right. How did you connect with each other for this? Like who did you guys know each other before, or how did this come about?
I've been trying to remember that, Sarah. Do you remember?
Somebody
Was it Q-Code?
somebody I knew in the publishing world kind of reached out. So I do a lot of ghostwriting, and I do a lot of sort of collaborating. So that's just within the publishing world, like people know that I do that anyway. And I've done it it's how kind of I got my start. And even before I published under my name, like I always was a ghostwriter. So I don't know how it came to me. I mean, it's probably somebody that I was a ghostwriter for kind of said, kind of that Miles was looking for like a collaborator, like a novelist collaborator on Gaslight. And I was like, I think I know Gaslight. So it came from like an agent or a publisher or something like that. And then I think we just started talking, and it kind of made sense to, I think we like figured out a way that like a novel that would really work, and a version of the novel. Again, like I feel like my job was so easy because so much of, that framework was there. So for me, I was like, well, this sounds fun. And I like ghostwriting. I like collaborating with other writers because writing sometimes is very lonely. And you're in your office all day, and it's your head and it's your story, and you struggle. And this was kind of like, oh my gosh, at least I can struggle through this with somebody else. Although honestly, it was not even a struggle. It was just such a good framework of a story and such an interesting topic that it was kind of, I felt very lucky that somebody reached out to me about it, because it was kind of like, oh, I absolutely want to do this. So that's kind of that's what I remember. And then you gave me, Miles, I obviously listened to the podcast again, and then you gave me all the pages from the scripts, which were extremely helpful and a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that was sort of the thing of like part of why when this sort of conversation first came about doing it as a novel, like for the podcast, it was really built, including the mystery of it, was really built for that medium, because for me, things that are specific to the way that you engage with them are always the most impactful. And so when I was writing it as a TV series, things did change sort of inherently, because I wanted it to work as a visual medium, and there were story beats that I didn't want to have sort of expositional dumps in certain places with audio. I didn't want to have, so then, but so, you find the collaborator that can sort of like fill in your weak points. And then it sort of, then when we talked about doing a novel, it was like, okay, but we need to find someone to do it with that is going to be the best at sort of like vocalizing this internal conversation, and that was some of the most fun stuff, was even just like emails back and forth of Sarah trying, diving into it, and all of a sudden questions that would come up in a novel that I hadn't had to sort of wrap my head around, because that sort of internal space didn't really exist in a series or in the podcast. So in that way, it was, it was the luckiest thing imaginable. And now the novel is coming out, and I sort of like can't believe it. It's really yeah, it's super exciting. And it's just like, for it to become this kind of like world that now feels so rich and full with all these characters, sort of psychologies that are overlapping in their own versions of different stories and stuff. For me, I feel like I have a kid who's now like in college or something. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, you have your own life, this beautiful, like, it's super, yeah, I feel really proud of it.
Well, there's a lot to be proud of in this. Again, it makes you think so deeply about moral compasses. And we always want everyone to have a moral compass. And we think, well, gee, as long as someone has a moral compass, and then that insidious twist of what happens when your true north moves and then your moral compass moves. Yeah, just absolutely brilliant work, both of you. Now, for existing fans and for future fans who will be coming in the droves because of Gaslight, where is the best place for people to find each of you?
I am on Instagram at Sara. What is my Instagram? Sara Shepard. I'm also on TikTok occasionally at Sara Shepard. I do a lot of Pretty Little Liars, like plot lines that didn't exist. I did just do a Gaslight TikTok about, again, all of my TikToks are about Pretty Little Liars. I apologize. But it was like which Pretty Little Liars character would join which cult.
Oh my God, how fun.
And then I am not really on Twitter X or whatever anymore, but mostly Instagram and TikTok. But DM me anytime. I try to get back to everybody.
Awesome. How about you, Miles?
I'm just on Instagram at Miles Joris-Peyrafitte. Yeah, I'm not. That's my home base.
Well, I don't know, if it's on TikTok. It sounds like it's mainly Pretty Little Liars stuff, but is his name Morris? Does Morris?
The tortoise?
Yeah, it's your tortoise, Morris. Does he show up on TikTok?
He needs his own page. I actually have many other animals, but he needs. I have a tortoise. He's about the size of a hamburger, but he needs his own page for sure. There need to be more tortoises on. He's my like writing buddy. He walks around my office.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It is awesome, and we were sorry that Morris wasn't able to stay for the interview today.
Well, he would have hurt his little feet. I was afraid he was gonna be too loud. Yeah.
Well, no one can be too loud in extolling the virtues of Gaslight. It is absolutely a phenomenal read. Go out and get it. You will not be disappointed. It will twist, it will bend, and it will make you think. The best part of all. Thank you, Miles and Sara, for joining me today on this episode of Twisted Passages. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.